Disneyland.
Walt Disney is about to see Disneyland for the first time. He's sitting in his living room with his family, watching their TV set. It's 4 days before Halloween, 1954. The television is tuned to ABC, a struggling new channel trying to compete with national giants NBC and CBS. They currently have no shows running in the top 25 for ratings, and have tied their future to the draw of the name, Walt Disney. Walt's relationship with ABC started over 3 years ago, when Walt first got an agent and started looking for television deals. The previous Christmas, his first and only television special, so far, aired on NBC. Negotiations with all 3 major networks progressed slowly. Sometimes this was from hesitance on the part of the Disneys. Other times, it was a result of indecisiveness on the network's part. Regardless, by March of 1953, when Walt was beginning to assemble the staff for WED Enterprises, there was still no TV deal. Early in the year, Walt took matters into his own hands. He issued orders for the WED team to develop a television series based on Zorro. While his brother Roy, Agent Jules Stein, the networks and corporate sponsors negotiated, Walt assembled a pitch and shopped it to the 3 major networks. All of them insisted on seeing a pilot first. Walt scoffed at the idea and abandoned the project. He turned the WED team back to working on the park and left the television negotiations to his brother and agent. While Walt was assembling the WED staff and pitching Zorro TV shows, Harper Goff was on his annual spring holiday. His itinerary, compared to previous years, was much more thorough. Goff visited locations from museums in St. Louis, New York, and D.C. to historic recreations in Colonial Williamsburg, Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, and of course, Henry Ford's Greenfield Village. Along the way, he stopped at Marineland in Florida, the Tallulah Falls Railroad in Georgia, and the Erie Canal. When he returned to LA, Goff joined a group of WED employees exploring amusement parks in the LA area, including Knott's Berry Farm. Walt made a special trip with Dick Irvine, where they measured the width of walkways, studied how crowds moved, and other specific details. Back at the WED bungalow, art director Dick Irvine was acting as liaison between the team and architects Pereira and Luckman, while another art director, Marvin Davis, worked on turning Goff's original sketches into elevations on the main village, the current name for the park's entrance area. Walt spent yet another summer in Europe, as he had the last several years, vacationing with his family and overseeing production on Rob Roy, the Highland Rogue. It was around this time that architects Luckman and Pereira finished their original sketches for the park. Working with the constant updates from the WED bungalow, the result the architects brought didn't impress Walt. Fundamentally, the designs were good, but the architects did what architects do. They designed buildings. Walt realized at this point that he didn't need buildings. What he wanted was the equivalent of movie sets, where the camera was the guest's eyes. Disney dismissed the architects from the project, though they maintained a positive relationship. At a party, Charles Luckman introduced Walt to Harrison Price from the Stanford Research Institute. That July, Walt hired Price and the SRI to scout potential locations for his park. Walt explained the layout, as it was currently planned, to Price. A long entrance down Main Street, with a castle in the middle drawing guests towards Fantasyland, with other lands radiating from a central hub. They estimated the necessary amount of land, with the additional requests from Walt that the land be within certain bounds around LA and in an area of current growth, with extra land available for the project in the future. While Price and the SRI searched the Los Angeles area for a suitable plot of land, the UN forces in Korea signed an armistice, essentially ending the active fighting. Eventually, SRI selected a site and the studio secured the land. While there were several other options available, The prime choice was a parcel of land called the Ball Subdivision. Located in Anaheim, the land met all of Walt's specifications. Walt got the news while in London. Once the land deal was confirmed as well, Walt assigned WED employee Marvin Davis to draw up new plans for the park based on the new land. As summer rolled into fall, negotiations between the Disneys and the big three television networks continued. One of the sticking points all along had been the park. In addition to funding any shows, Walt wanted the networks to take a stake in the new park, funding much of the construction costs. Most were reluctant at best, but by late September, ABC was ready to hammer out a deal. Roy scheduled to meet with the ABC executives on Monday the 25th, but he needed something to show them. The previous work of Harper Goff wouldn't work anymore. It presumed the use of the 7-acre Riverside lot in Burbank instead of the new 160-acre lot in Anaheim. The other drawings done by people like Marvin Davis and Don DeGrady were of individual attractions and didn't show the park as a whole. On the afternoon of September 23, 1953, 2 days before the ABC meeting, Herb Ryman, a former art director from the studio now working at Fox, was painting his house. He got a call from the Disney studio with a request from Walt himself. Get over to the studio as soon as possible. Walt told him to not even bother with changing clothes. When Ryman arrived, he was directed to the WED office, now colloquially known as the Zorro Building. Walt told Ryman he needed a drawing to show the ABC executives, and that he wanted Ryman to draw it. The two men worked for the next 2 days straight, with Walt chain-smoking and telling Ryman where everything belonged in the park. As soon as Ryman was finished, Dick Irvine and Marvin Davis of WED gave it a rudimentary pass of color, packaged it, and airmailed the drawing to New York. After almost 48 sleepless hours of work, cigarettes, coffee, tuna sandwiches, and milkshakes, the only thing left for Walt, Ryman, Irvine, and Davis was to wait. The news wasn't necessarily bad, but it certainly wasn't good. ABC declined to invest in the park. Chairman Leonard Goldenson was interested in the project, but the board was afraid the company couldn't find the money to invest in the park. Despite ABC's rejections, negotiation continued. Meanwhile, the Disney studio butted heads with their distributor, RKO, over one of the true-life adventure films called The Living Desert. The relationship was already rocky, and the studio felt RKO wasn't advertising their products enough. RKO felt The Living Desert's appeal was too limited for them to make a profit by distributing the film. Disney decided to release it themselves through a subsidiary established for the purpose called Buena Vista, after the road fronting the studio. The Living Desert, the first film distributed by Buena Vista, debuted in November, and still no TV deal. That January, at the State of the Union, President Eisenhower outlined a plan for a new federal interstate highway system, and still no TV deal. Harrison Price and the Stanford Research Institute, after helping Disney secure the land, were now tasked with helping plan the project. Their findings estimated a cost of $5.25 million for building Disneyland. By February, with the TV deal still stalled at ABC, Walt and Roy took a meeting with the head of CBS. When the network executives stood them up, they left and never rescheduled. For ABC, the delay on reaching a deal with the Disneys wasn't a matter of lack of interest, it was purely funding. ABC entered television in 1947. At that time, there were only about 44,000 television sets in the entire United States. 7 years later, as the Disney deal was being finished, nearly half of the country owned a television. ABC lagged behind national competitors NBC and CBS, struggling for cash the entire time. After being merged with the theatrical arm of Paramount, the studio was forced to divest itself after a court ruling. The network's connections to Hollywood and film became stronger. Even with these connections, ABC still had a hard time competing for adult audiences. Their lack of audience meant a lack of advertisers, and a lack of advertisers meant the network was always strapped for cash. Their solution was to focus on counter-programming, presenting shows for audiences not served by their competitors. One space where the market was still open was children and families. The post-war baby boom meant young families were on the rise, and many had multiple children. Some parents decried television as a corrupter of youth, but many others welcomed programs that would engage their children while being appropriate for younger audiences. For ABC, making a deal with Disney, the paragon of family entertainment even in the early 1950s, was an obvious choice. But Walt drove a hard bargain. They needed his name attached to their network and programming, but he expected them to fund something on an entirely different level with the park. It would take another couple months, but on April 2nd, 1954, in a joint press release, Disney and ABC announced their television deal. Disney will make the network 26 one-hour programs each year for the next 3 years. In addition to some funding for the shows, ABC would also take a stake in Disneyland Incorporated and invest almost $5 million in the park. ABC chair Leonard Goldenson secured the money in a loan to the network from a Texas oil millionaire who happened to be a former co-worker. Walt's later summarization of the deal was, quote, "ABC needed the television show so damned bad, they bought the amusement park." Now, Walt had to produce a TV show. The word Disneyland appears on the television, and everyone in the room, gathered around Walt, cheers. Animated stars twinkle, and a sparkling comet hurtles around the Disneyland logo. It crashes into the center, exploding in a shower of sparks, revealing Tinkerbell. And while the television broadcast introduces the world to the Disneyland story, touring the Disney studio in Burbank, Walt is thinking of the real place. Back in May, exactly 1 month after the studio and ABC announced their deal, the studio made another big announcement. Walt Disney was building a theme park, called Disneyland, in Anaheim. The project would be owned by Disneyland Incorporated. ABC and the studio took equal interest in the company, with Western Printing and Lithographing Company, publisher of the Disney books, taking between 1/7 and 1/8 of the company. Walt himself kept ownership of the remaining 1/6. In June, while Walt presumably, though can't find any evidence to prove it, vacationed in the Caribbean where 20,000 Leagues was filming, he sent Bill Cottrell and 3 other WED employees on a tour of the country. Their mission was to visit amusement parks, museums, arcades, really any entertainment venue that made sense, to gather more intel. Over at WED, the last 19 months had been insanity. Since the company was founded, its numbers had swelled. Most employees were working on the park and on studio work at the same time. Harper Goff worked on the art design of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as it went through production, as well as helping with the park and doing his yearly excursions in March. The design of the park had been tweaked and refined. Attractions had been proposed, added, eliminated, replaced, and brought back as different ideas and versions are tried. WED's designers, Roy, and even Walt himself have visited ride manufacturers. Finally, after all that effort and with a budget secured, the park's design is finished, and construction can begin. On July 12th, a month and a half after the studio announced the project, WED broke ground on the Disneyland site. Their deadline for completion was exactly 1 year. C.V. Wood, an SRI employee who helped get the last holdouts to sell their land to the park, is put in charge of the project. He also brings along Joe Fowler, who Walt puts in charge of supervising construction. In addition, Walt hired 2 veterans of the amusement park industry, his only experts on the project, as advisors, George Whitney and Ed Schott. The rest of the team are new to amusement parks, but that's the way Walt wants it. He's building something beyond a normal amusement park, and he wants his team free of preconceived notions. WED set up command in a few ranch houses at the back of the property, with animal trainers Owen and Dolly Pope, who Walt hired to get ponies for his park back in 1951 and who have been living on the studio lot ever since, moving into another ranch house on the property to manage the live animals. As construction began, Walt was regularly on hand to keep an eye on things. Studio work, however, still drew him away from his park. Last month, September, Walt visited Tennessee to check in on a series in production for the Disneyland show. At the same time, Roy was announcing that the studio would sever ties with their distributor of the last 18 years, RKO. The relationship between the companies had only deteriorated since the conflict over the Living Desert, and RKO's finances were increasingly unsteady. In the same move, the studio established its own distribution arm, Buena Vista, as the sole distributor of all Disney films going forward. After distributing some of the shorts, like The Living Desert, the first feature-length film Buena Vista distributes will be 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, set to release 2 days before Christmas. As he had with Alice in Wonderland, Walt will use television to promote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But the new show will also provide updates on the development of the park, which, as of this moment, a quarter of the way into construction, is still just a big hole in the ground. This first episode, however, is unique, where each other episode will be themed to one of the park's lands, Adventureland, Fantasyland, Frontierland, and Tomorrowland. This first one acts as more of an overview, with short vignettes around each land as it is introduced. Walt also walks guests through the park's design, starting with a miniature of Main Street, USA. As the credits roll, and When You Wish Upon a Star plays, everyone starts congratulating Walt. After a few minutes, the phone rings. The final numbers aren't in yet, but the early ratings look good. But this is still just the first episode. There are 77 more to go in the contract, and the important thing is how the show will do over the following weeks and months. There are only 25 episodes left in the first season, 25 episodes to sell the entire country on the real Disneyland before it opens, and only 9 months left to turn a muddy hole in Anaheim into the park of Walt Disney's dreams.